Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 33 of my secular Bible study series, and today we are focused on Micah. 33 means we are exactly halfway through the Protestant canon from a series or episode perspective, at least. In terms of the words, we're about 73% of the way through the Bible. We only have a few minor prophets left to get through before we get to the New Testament, which is really exciting. I know many of us might feel like we're done with all of these prophets. It's the same story over and over, and I get that. But each book, I think, has shown us something a little bit different, given us a little bit of a better idea about what was going on at this time, as well as, of course, some of the issues that can be taken with these books. Speaking of issues, stick around for point 7 today when we get to problematic passages, because there are so many, especially when you consider this book is only 7 chapters long. So let's go ahead and dive right into point 1, book overview. And for this, I'm just going to cover each chapter individually, give a high-level summary, and make sure that we have the correct context and background before moving on to the other points. So for chapter 1, and honestly for chapter 2, they go together here. It's just all of the warnings, right? Isn't this how all of them start? We're introduced to our prophet of this book, which is Micah. Micah is a contemporary of Jeremiah, to give you kind of an idea of the time frame. He is from the southern kingdom. This is still well after the Civil War, but before the Assyrians have come to conquer the northern kingdom and before Babylon will come to conquer the southern kingdom. So we have these two enemy nations always looming over with the threat, which really takes away from the prophetic majesty that is displayed in these books. I've talked about that a lot, though. It's just really not that impressive to have a general idea of impending doom from a particular enemy. Great. And sometimes they get it wrong, by the way. Sometimes they get it right. Micah has his warnings, and they're specific, which is something better than we got with Jonah, for instance. And he's really calling out a few things. One, he is calling out the people for not following the teachings of the Torah and all of the law, but he's also calling out the leadership. And this even includes other prophets that were essentially kind of like the earlier version of selling indulgences, where if you were paying them, they would tell you that God was going to protect you. So yeah, we have some corruption going on, at least according to Micah. Something else I've been wanting to point out for quite some time, because I hear it in the comments all the time in this series and in my other episodes, is when we get a list from these prophets of what the people are doing wrong, leadership taking advantage of the poor, for instance, it's nothing new. It's nothing that any other civilization hasn't gone through. It's nothing that we don't still do today in almost every single country around the world. This is just humanity. But so often it is told to us like, oh, the people were so wicked, and that's why God's destruction was totally fair. Well, then why don't we have God intervening now? And then through this ignorant hypocrisy, somehow out of the mouths of believers, we also get that we are so much worse than we've ever been. Look at our country now. Look at the things that are going on in society that no one has ever dealt with before. Well, if we're this bad, and in the past, when it wasn't this bad, like Sodom and Gomorrah, or even what happened when God had to wipe out the whole earth with the flood, or all the times that he has punished the Israelites, where is all this grand punishment now? Does God no longer care? Did his standards change? We need to come to grips with the fact that this is just reality. This is just human existence. You get enough people together in a society and you're going to have some bad apples. Nothing is all this special. But anyways, I digress. So we're getting all the warnings, and I've kind of gone through with you what the main issues of the time were. And that's going to cover 1 and 2. And again, we'll get back to some specific verses in point 7. And I guess I jumped ahead a little bit because I'm looking here at chapter 3. And this is when the rulers and the prophets are called out. So 1 and 2 is more just the general warning of destruction. 3, we're starting to get specific with to who and why. And then we get to 4. It's called the Mountain of the Lord. This is a really strange chapter. It's kind of 2 parts. And by the way, many of these chapters have kind of an A and B section. And A, we get the warning, we get God's anger, we get the impending doom and the wrath. And then B, we get this hope. And this happens here in the book of Micah, probably more than I've seen in most of the other prophetic books that we have covered, where it's almost like God can't make up his mind. Oh, I'm so mad. I hate this. I can't stand this. I'm going to have to destroy you. But don't worry, because even after I destroy you later, I'll build you back up. It's just A, B, A, B, A, B. It's happening constantly in this tiny little book, back and forth, back and forth. So that's a lot of 4, is just really setting the stage for here's how awful you are. Here's what I'm going to do to you. But again, don't worry, I've got a plan for the future. Now, these plans for the future, and especially in chapter 5, when we get to a prediction of Jesus, are confusing to say the least, because he bounces back and forth in the immediate context of specific cities and specific events that are happening, again, like the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom that's to come. But then some of the things, as Micah predicts, again, supposedly Jesus, which he's not here, or a perfect utopian society, obviously are not the case. He's jumping way further in the future, or we say he is, because these things did not transpire immediately. We're just moving the goalpost. So that's a lot of 4 and 5. 5 is specifically titled The Ruler to be Born in Bethlehem, which I know the titles, by the way, are not like canon, but just to give you an overview of how the authors who put together this translation see what is happening here. And again, a lot of that comes into play as the New Testament looks back and tries to make connections. 6 is the indictment of the Lord, where we hear all about what the Lord requires and how best to please him and what we haven't been doing correctly and the destruction of the wicked. And then 7 moves into this end kind of summary, if you will, some additional warnings, some additional hope, some additional punishments, and then the most ironic last 3 verses considering everything that was just covered. So again, stay tuned for point 7 and we will get into all of that. So let's move into point 2, which is authorship and date. Traditional authorship, of course, goes to Micah. And unlike many books that we've covered where that is just clearly an impossibility, there's good reason to believe that the core message here of Micah was indeed written by a prophet or someone that considered themselves a prophet named Micah around the 8th century BCE. That's when these events are happening. We have a lot of events here. We know who the kings were. We know who the rulers were. We know who other prophets were. There's mentions of so many cities in these 7 chapters that we can really give ourselves a pretty good specific date and time, but I'm bleeding into point 3. So again, getting back to authorship, there is some ideas that because of some of the events mentioned, there's probably some redacting and editing that happened from a core group of people that are amalgamating all of this. But again, we still have the main message being from Micah himself, and again, 8th century BCE. So point 3, which is just the historical context, background, and accuracy, it's pretty good. I mean, we know that these things happened. We know the Assyrians came. We know they were all over and invading the Levant at this time. We know from inscriptions and writing and archaeology that we definitely had some societal imbalance, if you will, rich and poor, some of the things that Micah is calling out here. We know that many of these cities existed. We know where they existed and when they existed. So, I mean, from a historical point of view, until you get to the more outlandish prophetic parts, like these utopians and these rulers to be born in the future that somehow equal Jesus, were pretty accurate. But again, those other parts really fall short. And we'll talk about that when we actually get to reading the specific verses. So I know we're breezing through this, but we've covered, 4 or 5 other books that happened at this exact time frame where we've talked about the historical accuracy and background. So not a whole lot to add here. Let's move on to point 4, which is literary analysis. This is in the grouping of prophetic narration. We have a series of oracles and judgments being displayed by Micah, interspersed with promises of hope and a future and restoration. And I think that this alternating structure really goes to show the tension that is with these people. What is going to happen? Are we doing enough to please this God? If we're not, what's he going to do to us? If he does that to us, will he bring us back? Will he abandon us once and for all? So again, I think that it's purposeful that, again, we have this A, B, A, B, A, B happening that I mentioned earlier. In terms of the techniques used, we have a lot of imagery and symbolism. In fact, right off the bat in Micah, things get pretty intense. Let me tell you, this is the coming destruction. And I'll just read this to you. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth, and the mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will split open like wax before the fire, like waters pour down a steep place. So again, this goes on and on and on. Anytime that Micah is talking about the destruction, it's pretty darn vivid. We get a lot of repetition, a lot of parallelism, and something that's unique to this book that we've seen before, but I haven't covered as much, is rhetorical questions. We get this so much. And it's Micah asking the audience, and sometimes Micah asking God. But again, I think it's to kind of up the sense of importance and urgency. Who do you think you are? How are we supposed to please this God, right? And then he goes into his diatribe. So pretty interesting techniques being used in this book. And let's move straight into point 5 then, main themes. Now, even though this entire section of the Old Testament seems to be the same themes over and over, God's sovereignty, divine justice, etc., I try to spice them up as much as I can and be a little more specific when and where I can. So for Micah, I'm going to give you 3 themes. I don't agree, by the way, that these are like what is actually happening, but this is what the prophet is trying to convey. And those would be justice, mercy, and humility. Everything is always reduced back to God's justice. It cannot go undealt with. His glory demands it of him, unless it doesn't, or unless someone bargains with him, or unless he doesn't seem to know you exist, etc. Mercy. Even in 7 chapters filled with destruction and terror and the horror that God will definitely impose on his people, we are told that we should love mercy, and we are told that we serve a God of mercy. It really is like an abuse victim trying to excuse their abuser. And then humility. And that one might be one that's more specific and unique to Micah than some of the other books. Micah is trying to bring everyone down a peg. Humble yourselves before the Lord. See how awful and terrible you are. See how wayward you have gone. So if I had to say, that would be the 3 themes I would put forward. For point 6, which is reception and influence, I really just want to give the 2 different takes on this from the Jewish and the Christian traditions. From the Jewish tradition, this is just more good reminders of the importance of ethics and morality, that God has the perfect system laid out in the Torah and that we need to follow it or else. It really is that simple. The Christian tradition, of course, looks at this and extrapolates. Different sects of Christianity have made this about the end times. They have made it about the time and place in which it was. They have made it about Jesus and things that happen in the New Testament. We are all over the board, really whatever suits us. If we can point to it, if there's some loose correlation, they're going to pull on that chain. It is fascinating how this is the inspired word of God. We have a prophet who is not a false prophet, by the way, because all the false prophets are called out by this one prophet. It makes you wonder which prophets you can trust. And I guess in this case, it's the ones that made their way into the canon. But I think that's something that we often sometimes forget. Just like there were tons of Messiah characters besides Jesus, there were tons of prophets in God's chosen people group alone, yet alone the prophets for other nations, etc. Like, we zoom in so far, pick out just a couple that happened through organic human processes of why we consider them better than others, and we developed a religion off of it. And I think it's equal parts fascinating and terrifying. Equal parts fascinating and terrifying should be the name of the book that I write. Anyways, that's enough for reception and influence. Let's move on to point 7, which is contradictions and problematic passages. And in keeping with what we've seen for most of these minor prophets, there's not a lot of contradictions other than in God's character. But we don't get so much here that we can say, okay, it says this here, but over here it said this. It's just describing potential future happenings from this God of wrath. Again, what we're mainly going to focus on are problematic passages. I've got a bunch of highlights I've done here. I'm not going to get to all of them, but let's just kind of go through in order, starting with Micah chapter 1. And the very first thing it says is, "Hear you people, all of you, pay attention, O earth, and all that is in it." And I point this out just to show that even when a prophet of God is speaking for God, they assume that this is everything. I mean, all of you, O earth, all that is in it. Like, that's not mincing words. Yeah, you could say maybe it's a bit hyperbolic, but it just doesn't make sense. It honestly seems like Micah thinks that this is for everyone, when clearly God had no idea, nor did Micah, that the other side of the world even existed, or even in like 500 miles in any given direction. See this video, by the way, if you want to learn a whole lot more about that. So I think that that's interesting and problematic. Then if we get to verse 12, we have this: "Because disaster has come down from the Lord to the gate of Jerusalem." Now, I wanted to point this out in lieu of our conversation from my Tuesday video and his argument that God does not create evil, and yet right here, and again, ESV is very loose with this stuff, and they always go with the better sounding word, "because disaster has come down from the Lord." But that word is ra. Now that you are familiar with this word and how it can be changed based off the context, once again, we have disaster has come down from the Lord, evil has come down from the Lord, calamity has come down from the Lord, whatever you want to call it. By the way, none of its synonyms are good. If God created calamity that hurts, kills, and makes suffering, like what else do you call that? It's still evil. You didn't get yourself out of the pinch you think you did. I digress. Let's move down to verse 16. Make yourselves bald and cut off your hair for the children of your delight. So again, this is something you would do as an act of mourning. You would cut your hair, for they shall go from you into exile. So here we have God threatening the punishment of having their children taken from them. What a good, loving, and just God this is. Let's move into chapter 3, verse 4. Then they will cry to the Lord, but he will not answer them. He will hide his face from them at that time, because they have made their deeds evil. Same word, raw. Once again, when people do it, it's evil, but when God is doing it, it's just calamity or disaster. If people are born into religions that are not Christianity, or they're born into more of a secular or atheist family, and they don't know the Bible, and they don't know these things, they don't have the Holy Spirit in them, they don't have these repentant hearts that the Holy Spirit can give them. And because of their wickedness, God hates them, as he says in other verses, or hides from them, as he says here. How is anyone that is not immediately born a Christian supposed to find God? But let's keep going here. If we go to chapter 4, I want to read you this beauty. It starts in verse 3. He shall judge between many peoples and shall decide for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. So there's two things here. One, the very beginning there, he shall judge between many peoples and shall decide for strong nations far away. So again, this I think is pretty clear that God is deciding things and making things happen and enacting things on behalf of people groups. That means there's no free will, again, and obviously. And then it gets into this utopia. Just make yourself a field. It will always be fruitful. You'll always have your tree to sit under. You won't even know how to do war anymore. There won't be any more fear. That's never happened. And it's in context like it's about to happen. We didn't just jump to the year 30,000 CE. This is within the context of this time, like God's going to deal harshly with you. We're going to have these captivities, these exiles, your babies will be taken from you. But then there is a time that comes of restoration and hope, which by the way did happen. The people did come back from captivity. They did get their land back. And yet, as I speak, Israel is involved in war. Again, the Christian today will obviously take that as a future promise of things to come, but it just doesn't make sense contextually. Sticking in chapter 4, we get this pretty interesting little ditty here. Now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Here's all the rhetorical questions. Has your counselor perished? That pain seized you like a woman in labor? Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. This is like right after and explaining about that utopia. So once again, it's knocking the people back down. Here comes the humility that I mentioned in main themes. We get what will happen in Babylon. We get that they will come back from Babylon, clearly referencing that when they come back and the redemption happens, they'll have this utopia. Wrong, and wrong. Let's move on to chapter 5 and talk a little bit about this Jesus prediction. It starts with verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until that time, when she who is in labor has given birth, when the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. Now, I could go on here, but very clearly he's tying it back into what we just read in point 4, which is after the captivity in Babylon, this will happen with your redemption. This is something that is supposed to be in the immediate near future, not 800 years later. Also, can someone remind me, did Jesus ever rule over Israel during his 33 years? No. The mental gymnastics that Christians have to do to work their way back to these verses in Micah chapter 5 about how Jesus came from Bethlehem. And then you even have the New Testament anonymous writers trying to find, how are we going to get this guy out of Egypt, which is another prophecy we have to make happen, called a Nazarene and also born in Bethlehem. And so they're arranging all of these things, these censuses that never happened, this King Herod attack on the children under 2 that never happened. Like, It's outlandish, honestly. Let's move on. Verse 12, and I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no more tellers of fortune. This is just a little thing I love. I love any time that the God of the Bible recognizes other magic as real. It happens everywhere. Divining rods, seers, necromancers. I mean, it's right in line with blood magic and everything else, but we have this idea in our head that there's God, there's, yes, maybe some demonic powers, but magic isn't real. No, magic was very real to these people. Even real to God that he would shut down magic sometimes when it suited him. If this were about demons or the devil, he would be stating such. I will no longer allow the demons to possess you in such a fashion. No, that verbiage doesn't come till the New Testament when these ideas start to come up from Greco-Roman borrowing. We didn't have this in the Old Testament. We had the Satan character who is the accuser working for God, essentially. So when it talks about magic as if it's actually happening, that God has to put a stop to it, it's not God's powers, it's not demonic powers, it's because just magic exists. It's just baffling and stupid. Kind of similar is going to be verse 14. And I will root out your Asherah images from among you and destroy your cities. And in anger and wrath, I will execute vengeance on the nations that do not obey. So again, we have the, anger and wrath part and all of the harm that God loves to inflict. But specifically here, and it's the first time I remember seeing this in the canon, it's obviously elsewhere, I will root out your Asherah images. Now, I've covered this a lot in my Dissecting the Divine series, but Asherah in common ancient Israel is the cohort or wife of Yahweh. There's iterations where Yahweh, when he usurped his father El, stole his wife, which is a pretty common God trope throughout all of the ancient world. And at some point, God wanted to be the only God. So we see the rest of the Canaanite pantheon wither away, and this son of El, storm god, who had a wife, just becomes Yahweh, the creator, the most high, the one and only, the King of kings, the Lord of lords. And we see his jealousy spark through here because at this time, people still had Asherah images. In fact, there's good reason to believe that in the Israelite temples, there would have still been statues of both Yahweh and Asherah, that they were worshiping both, but not anymore. Time to start kicking her out and developing our idea of this unified, monotheistic, but also Trinitarian God that starts to develop as we get closer to the New Testament. So, anything else? Just a couple. In chapter 6, verse 3, "O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me," with an exclamation. "For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery." So there's a few things here. One, I love God not understanding all of the horror and terror that he has inflicted on these people. What have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me. It's just such a good depiction of the ridiculousness of this God who views himself as perfect and steadfast in love and divine in mercy, etc. Like, dude, read what we've just covered here. There's plenty of reasons they could answer you. They're probably just terrified to. And then his little brag, "For I brought you up from the land of Egypt." You also left them there for 400 to 430 years, depending on the contradictions from Exodus, and redeemed you from the house of slavery. Wait a second. Being redeemed from slavery, why would anyone need to be redeemed from slavery? I thought slavery was a good thing, a way to work off your debts. I mean, otherwise you would be ultimately destroyed. Aren't those the excuses that Christian apologists give for slavery in the Bible? This is what I love. Time and time and time again, God talks about how he brought them out of slavery in Egypt, how that was a bad thing, and getting out of it is a good thing. So what is his excuse for turning around and allowing his people group to enslave the neighbors around them? I'll give you one word: hypocrisy. There's so much more I have labeled here, but let's just end with two more, I think. I'll start at 15 in chapter 7. "As in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt, I will show them marvelous things." Like plagues that destroy all the innocent Egyptian firstborns. "The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands over their mouths, their ears shall be deaf, and they shall lick the dust like a serpent. They shall come trembling out of their strongholds. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall be in fear of you." So again, this is the revenge fantasy of Israel. We see this in almost every single book. And why I say that is because the last three verses that follow it immediately are so tone deaf to what has just happened here. "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance. He does not retain his anger because he delights in steadfast love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot and cast out our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. And that is how the book ends, with righteous fear, judgment, wrath, and horror for our enemies, and steadfast love and mercy for Israel. Again, it is the abuser who just saw their brother get murdered by dad and was like, they had it coming. You're right, dad. You should have done that to them. But I remember you told me when I was the firstborn that I was going to be your favorite, and that you're a good God, and that you're so forgiving, God. You're so loving. Thank you for that. It's like a plea. Don't do this to me. This is disgusting to the nth degree. So that's the book of Micah. I hope that you learned something. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on it, anything that I got wrong, anything you'd like to add, any context you would like to make sure is included. Hopefully I'll have another episode for you Saturday morning. That's a maybe. It could be either another song deconstruction, could be another episode of When Christians Respond, or it could be another episode of Dissecting the Divine. I hope to get something to you Saturday morning. And then Sunday, I'm really excited. I think the video that I'm going to film sometime this week before Sunday is going to be all the times that God commands people to sin in order to act out his vengeance. It's obviously very problematic, and we have more examples of that than you would believe. So thanks for being here, and until all of that, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast and GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Sparky, Stephanie, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you simply enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks, and have a great day.